My second experience with intellectual societies was with the John Randolph Club, which had been founded in 1989 by the libertarian, my mentor, Murray Rothbard, and the conservative Thomas Fleming. The Randolph Club was a coalition of two distinct groups of intellectuals. On the one hand, there was a group of anarcho-capitalist Austro-libertarians led by Rothbard, mostly of economists, but also of philosophers, lawyers, historians, and sociologists, mostly of a more theoretical, analytical bent of mind. I was a member of this group. On the other hand was a group of writers associated with the conservative monthly Chronicles, a magazine of American culture, and its editor, Thomas Fleming. Paul Gottfried was a member of that group. The conservative group did not have any economists of note and generally displayed a more empirical bent of mind. Apart from historians and sociologists, it included in particular also men of letters, of philologists, literary writers, and cultural critics. On the libertarian side, the cooperation with conservatives was motivated by the insight that while libertarianism might be logically compatible with many cultures, sociologically it required a conservative bourgeois core culture. The decision to form an intellectual alliance with conservatives then involved for the libertarians a double break with the establishment libertarianism as represented, for instance, by the Washington, D.C. free market Cato Institute. This establishment libertarianism was not only theoretically in error with its commitment to the impossible goal of limited government, and centralized government at that, it was also sociologically flawed with its anti-bourgeois, indeed adolescent, so-called cosmopolitan cultural message of multiculturalism and egalitarianism, of respect no authority, of live and let live, of hedonism and libertinism. The anti-establishment Austro-libertarians sought to learn more from the conservative side about the cultural requirements of a free and prosperous commonwealth. And by and large, I think they did and learned their lesson. At least I think that I did. For the conservative side of the alliance, the cooperation with the Austrian anarcho-capitalists signified a complete break with the so-called neoconservative movement that had come to dominate organized conservatism in the United States, and which was represented, for instance, by such Washington, D.C. think tanks as the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation. The paleo-conservatives, as they came to be known, opposed the neoconservative goal of a highly and increasingly centralized, economically efficient welfare warfare state as incompatible with the traditional conservative core values of private property, of family and family households, of local communities, and of their protection. There were some points of contention between the paleo-cons and the libertarians on the issue of abortion and immigration, and on the definition and necessity of government. But these differences could be accommodated in agreeing that their resolution must not be attempted on the level of the central state or even some supranational institution such as the United Nations, but always on the smallest level of social organization, that is, on the level of families and of local communities. For the paleo-cons, secession from a central state was not a taboo, and for the Austro-libertarians, secession had the status of a natural human right, while establishment libertarians, such as the Cato Institute, typically treat secession as a taboo subject. Hence, cooperation with the conservatives and the libertarians was possible. Moreover, the cooperation with the Austro-libertarians was to afford the conservatives the opportunity of learning sound Austrian school economics, which was an acknowledged gap and weakness in their own intellectual armor, especially vis-à-vis their neoconservative opponents. However, with some notable exceptions, the conservative group failed to live up to these expectations. And this, then, was the ultimate reason for the breakup of the Libertarian-Conservative Alliance that was accomplished with the John Randolph Club, namely that while the libertarians were willing to learn their cultural lesson, the conservative did not want to learn their economics. This verdict and the consequent lesson was not immediately clear, of course. It was driven home only in the course of the events. In the case of the Randolph Club, the event had a name. It was Patrick Buchanan, a TV personality, commentator, syndicated columnist, best-selling book author, including some serious works on revisionist history, a very charismatic man, witty, and with great personal charm, but also a man with a deep and lasting involvement in Republican Party politics. First as a Nixon speechwriter, and then as a White House Director of Communications under Ronald Reagan. Pat Buchanan did not participate directly in Randolph Club meetings, but he had personal ties to several of its leading members on both sides of the club, but especially to the Chronicles group, which included some of his closest personal advisors. And he was considered a prominent part of the countercultural movement that was represented by the Randolph Club. In 1992, Buchanan challenged then sitting President George Bush for the GOP presidential nomination. He would do so again in 1996 when he challenged Senator Bob Dole for the Republican nomination. And again in 2000, he would run as a presidential candidate for the Reform Party. Now, Buchanan's challenge was impressive at first, nearly upsetting Bush in the New Hampshire primary, and it initially caused considerable enthusiasm in Randolph Club circles. However, in the course of Buchanan's campaign, and in reaction to it, open dissent between the two Randolph Club camps broke out regarding the correct strategy. Buchanan pursued a populist America First campaign. He wanted to talk and appeal to the so-called middle Americans who felt betrayed and dispossessed by the political elites of both parties. After the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War, Buchanan wanted to bring all American troops back home, dissolve the NATO, leave the United Nations, and conduct a non-interventionist foreign policy, which his neoconservative enemies smeared, of course, immediately as isolationist. He wanted to cut all but economic ties to Israel in particular, and he openly criticized the un-American influence of the organized Jewish American lobby, something that takes considerable courage in contemporary America. He wanted to eliminate all affirmative action and non-discrimination and quota laws that had pervaded all aspects of American life and which were essentially anti-white and especially anti-white male laws. In particular, he promised to end the non-discriminatory immigration policy that had resulted in the mass immigration of low-class third world people and the attendant forced integration, or euphemistically, multiculturalism. Further, he wanted to end the entire cultural rot coming out of Washington, D.C. by closing down the Federal Department of Education and a multitude of other federal indoctrination agencies. But instead of emphasizing these, at that time, widely popular rightist cultural concerns, Buchanan, in the course of his campaign, increasingly intoned other economic matters and concerns, all the while his own knowledge of economics was rather skimpy. Concentrating on what he was worst at then, he increasingly advocated a leftist economic program of economic and social nationalism. He advocated tariffs to protect essential American industries and to save American jobs from unfair competition by foreigners, and he proposed to protect middle Americans by safeguarding and even expanding the already existing welfare state programs of minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. When I explained in a speech before the Randolph Club that Buchanan's rightist cultural and on the other hand his leftist economic program was theoretically inconsistent and that his strategy must consequently fail to reach its own goal, that is, that you cannot return America to cultural sanity and strengthen its families and communities and at the same time maintain the institutional pillars that are the central cause for the cultural malaise, that protectionist tariffs cannot make Americans more prosperous but less, and that a program of economic nationalism must alienate the intellectually and culturally indispensable bourgeoisie while attracting the, for us and our purposes at least, useless proletariat. It almost came to an eclat. The conservative group was up in arms about this critique of one of their heroes. I had hoped that, notwithstanding feelings of friendship or personal loyalty, after some time of reflection, reason would prevail, especially after it had become clear by the ensuing events that Buchanan's strategy had also failed numerically at the polls. I thought that the Randolph Club conservatives would sooner or later come to realize that my critique of Buchanan was an immanent critique, that is, that I had not criticized or distanced myself from the goal of the Randolph Club, and presumably also Buchanan's own goal of a conservative cultural counter-revolution, but that based on elementary economic reasons, I had simply found the means, the strategy chosen by Buchanan to accomplish this goal unsuitable and ineffective. But nothing happened. There was no attempt to refute my arguments, nor was there any sign that one was willing to express some intellectual distance to Buchanan and his program. From this experience, I learned a twofold lesson. First, a lesson that I had already come away with from my encounter with the Mont Pelerin Society was reinforced. Do not put your trust in politicians, and do not get distracted by politics. Buchanan, notwithstanding his many appealing personal qualities, was still at heart a politician who believed in government above all as a means of effecting social change. Second, and more generally, however, I learned that it is impossible to have a lasting intellectual association with people who are either unwilling or incapable of grasping principles of economics. Economics, or the logic of action, is the queen of the social sciences. It is by no means sufficient for an understanding of social reality, but it is necessary and indispensable. Without a solid grasp of economic principles, say on the level of Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, one is bound to commit serious blunders of historical explanation and interpretation. Thus I concluded that the Property and Freedom Society not only had to exclude all politicians and government agents and propagandists as objects of ridicule and contempt, as emperors without clothes and the butt of all jokes, rather than objects of admiration and emulation, but it also had to exclude all economic ignoramuses.